Let's learn more about the establishment of colonies in North America and the first European settlers. In the 16th and 17th centuries, European influence in North America began to grow rapidly. The first European discoveries began in the 15th century. Christopher Columbus's discovery in 1492 triggered Spanish and other European powers' interest and interaction in the region. The first European settlers landed in North America usually in the 16th century. Spanish, French, English, and Dutch sailors and settlers reached various parts of the continent during this period. Spanish explorers established the first settlements, especially in Florida and the Southwest. Founded in 1565, St. Augustine, now located in Florida, is one of the cities considered the oldest European settlement in North America. The French established colonies on the east coast of Canada, especially along the St. Lawrence River. Quebec, founded by Samuel de Champlain in 1608, became one of the centers of this French colonization. The French often interacted with the indigenous peoples in the region by trading and establishing peaceful relations with them. The English established their first successful colony in North America in 1607 in Virginia. This settlement, known as Jamestown, became England's first permanent colony. In addition to Virginia, English settlers established colonies in Plymouth Colony in Massachusetts, 1620, and other New England territories. The English colonies often experienced conflicts with indigenous peoples, which complicated relations in the region. The Dutch established a colony called New Netherland and settled mainly in the area of present-day New York. This was an important example of Dutch influence in North America. However, Dutch influence in North America was relatively short-lived, and in 1664 it was conquered by the British and came under British rule as New York. Many of these early settlements faced harsh living conditions, conflicts with indigenous peoples, and other challenges. However, these colonies developed and expanded over time, forming the cornerstones of the political and cultural map of North America today. This process helps us understand the complexity of European colonization in North America and the key turning points in the history of this region. In the 17th century, the motivations of people migrating from Europe to North America were complex and stemmed from a variety of political, social, and economic reasons. Political instability in Europe, especially conflicts between England, France, and Spain, triggered people's search for a safe life. Major conflicts, such as the 30 Years' War, caused migrants to look for places where there was no war and unrest. Religious conflicts and oppression in Europe, especially tensions between Protestants and Catholics, increased migrants' search for religious freedoms. For example, Puritans leaving England migrated to North America to live their religious beliefs freely. Some groups in Europe sought new territories offering greater political and personal freedom to escape absolute monarchies and centralized governments. In the 17th century, population growth in Europe made living conditions difficult, especially in agricultural areas and cities. This encouraged the search for land and resources. Social mobility and inequalities resulted in people from the lower classes seeking better living conditions. North America offered social and economic opportunities for these individuals. In the New World, especially the opportunities for extensive land ownership and independent living were seen as an escape from the cramped and limited social structure in Europe. The limited economic opportunities in Europe encouraged the search for wealth in new lands. In particular, new areas were sought for the exploitation of agriculture, mining, and other natural resources. Land shortages in Europe, especially in England and the Netherlands, led to the need to find new farmland. Large areas of land in North America became attractive to meet this need. The demand for labor for agriculture and other economic activities allowed immigrants to find new opportunities in North America. In addition, the slave trade played an important economic role. Taken together, these reasons make it easier to understand the motivations behind migration to North America in the 17th century. The complex social, economic, and political situation in Europe led individuals and groups to seek new and more promising opportunities. In the 17th century, European immigrants to North America developed methods of self-governance in the settlements from Europe. These methods varied in various regions, but generally included the following elements: local government organizations. European immigrants established their self-governance systems at the local government level. Especially in the British colonies, local councils and governing bodies were established at the village and town level. These bodies were responsible for solving local problems and running the day-to-day administration. Elections and representative government. Many colonies developed a system of representation that recognized the right of citizens to vote and be elected. For example, in some British colonies, white male adults could participate as voters in local assemblies and other governing bodies if they met certain tax and property requirements. This ensured that rulers were representatives of the people. Contracts and agreements. Some colonies drew up various social and administrative conventions for settlers to self-govern. One of the most famous is the Mayflower Compact, signed in Plymouth Colony in 1620. This charter aimed to establish a fair and orderly government within the colony and set out administrative regulations. Systems of law and justice. The colonies created their own legal systems. Local assemblies usually made and enforced their own laws. These systems were designed to suit local needs and may have been influenced by European legal traditions such as English law. Religious and social structures. In many colonies, religious groups ran social administration and education. Especially in the Puritan colonies of New England, churches played a central role in social governance and education. Religion was seen as an important tool for maintaining social order. Education and public services. Immigrants established various local structures to organize public services such as education and health. Education was often provided by religious groups, especially religious schools and colleges. These methods developed the capacity for self-government of European immigrants in early North America, and these practices later contributed to shaping the basic principles of American democracy. In the 17th century, colonies established in North America, the relationship between church and state varied according to the character of the colonies and the beliefs of the settlers. In general, the relationship between church and state during this period was complex and often intertwined. Let us first look at the Puritan colonies established in New England. The Puritans put religious life at the center of social life. The church guided not only religious activities, but also social and community order. Church membership was seen as a prerequisite for citizenship rights. Churches played an important role in setting social norms and enforcing the law. In Puritan colonies, church and state were often united in the same structure. Legislators and local administrators were often intertwined with church leaders. This created a structure in which religious rules and laws merged with the laws of the state. The other British colony, the Anglican colonies, also have an important place. In the southern colonies, the Anglican Church was often recognized as the official religion of the state. For example, in colonies such as Virginia and South Carolina, the Anglican Church played an important role in public service and government affairs. The Anglican Church was considered part of the state. It was funded by taxes and influential in state affairs. However, religious freedoms were often more limited in these territories. In the French colonies, especially in Canada, the Catholic Church played an important role in social and educational services. The Church sought to Christianize the indigenous population through missionary activities and was interested in education. In the French colonies, there was a strong relationship between the state and the Church. The Church was influential in local governments and education systems, but with a certain separation from state authority. The Netherlands is known for its religious tolerance, and therefore established colonies where different religious groups coexisted. This meant that the Church's interference in state affairs was limited. the relationship between state and church was looser in the Netherlands than in other European colonies. The Dutch colonies were more open about religious freedom, and the church was generally independent of state affairs. In general, the relationship between church and state in the North American colonies in the 17th century differed according to the religious, cultural, and political context of each colony. In many colonies, the church played an important role in state affairs, while in others it was more independent. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the development of Americanism in North America was shaped by a combination of social, cultural, and political factors. This process was characterized by the interaction of European settlers in the region with indigenous peoples, the formation of their own identities, and the emergence of a new American culture. Settlers laid the foundations of American identity by interacting with indigenous peoples and, over time, engaging in cultural exchanges with them. However, these interactions often led to conflicts and cultural clashes. The first colonies were formed by the coming together of different ethnic and religious groups from Europe. These groups began to adapt to their new environment while preserving their own cultural traditions. This process played an important role in the formation of American identity. In the 18th century, common experiences among the colonies, especially tensions in relations with Britain and independence movements, contributed to the formation of an American identity. Common problems and experiences developed a sense of unity. Under economic and political pressure from Britain, the colonies sought independence. The Declaration of Independence, proclaimed in 1776, became a concrete expression of American identity. It emphasized the right of the American people to establish their own government and became a symbol of the struggle for independence. American culture was shaped by European influences, as well as the contributions of indigenous peoples and African slaves. During this period, American literature, art, and music began to develop a uniquely American character. The U.S. Constitution, adopted in 1787, laid the foundations for a federal government and defined the legal and political aspects of American identity. The Constitution guaranteed established values and freedoms which reinforced the American national identity. In the field of education and science, American universities and scientists began to develop their own unique contributions. This created an intellectual foundation for American culture and identity. As a result, the development of Americanism in North America in the 17th and 18th centuries was shaped by the interactions of settlers, indigenous peoples, and slaves, their shared experiences, and their quest for independence. This process laid the cornerstones of American culture and national identity. The New England colonies were some of the first colonies established by Britain in North America in the 17th century, and included the 6 states that make up the New England region today: Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. These colonies were shaped by the interactions of immigrants from Europe and indigenous peoples and developed a regional identity. Here is some basic information about the New England colonies. Plymouth Colony was founded by English Puritans known as Pilgrims. They came to America on the Mayflower in 1620. This colony is considered one of the first permanent English settlements in America and is a symbol of the Pilgrims' quest for religious freedom. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was founded by a group of Puritans led by John Winthrop. The colony aimed to create a model Christian community as a hill over the city. The Massachusetts Bay Colony grew to become one of the largest and most influential colonies in New England. It led the way in terms of education and religious life. The Connecticut Colony was founded by Puritans led by Thomas Hooker. This colony was recognized for its principles of religious freedom and democratic government. The Fundamental Orders, adopted in 1638, is one of the first written constitutions and reflects Connecticut's democratic approach to governance. Rhode Island was founded by Roger Williams. Williams settled in this colony to escape religious intolerance. Rhode Island is known for its progressive approaches to religious freedom and tolerance. This became one of the cornerstones of American democratic traditions. New Hampshire was founded as part of Britain's colonial efforts. It originally consisted of small settlements and was part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. New Hampshire shared similar social and economic structures with the other New England colonies, but played a less influential role. The New England colonies were founded by Puritans, and religious life was central to the social structure. Churches played a central role in education and community governance. Education was emphasized by Puritan communities. Harvard University, founded in 1636, is known as the first university in America. New England's economy was based on shipping, fishing, and agriculture. Forests and natural resources were important for construction and trade. Local government and democratic processes were developed in the colonies. Local assemblies and elected officials enabled social decision-making. In the New England colonies, local assemblies and governments adopted an approach to governance that encouraged public participation. The colonies were the scene of various conflicts and rebellions with indigenous peoples and other European powers. For example, King Philip's War, 1675 to 1678, was a major conflict. The New England colonies had a significant impact on the historical and cultural development of North America and helped shape American democracy, education, and religious freedom. In the 17th century, the middle and southern colonies in North America were founded by various European powers and developed different social, economic, and political structures. Here is detailed information about these colonies. First known as New Netherland, founded by the Dutch in 1624, the area was conquered by England in 1664 and renamed New York. New York played an important role as a strategic trade center and port. During both the Dutch and British periods, it attracted attention with its cosmopolitan structure. New Jersey was founded by England in 1664, taken from the Dutch and made into a colony with two territories, east and west. In 1702, the two territories merged into a single colony. New Jersey was a fertile region for agriculture and trade. It had a multicultural society where various ethnic groups and religions lived together. In 1681, the colony of Pennsylvania was founded. Its founder was William Penn. Penn was the leader of a Quaker faith group and aimed to establish a colony that offered religious freedoms. Pennsylvania was a pioneer in religious tolerance and social reforms. Philadelphia became an important center of commerce and culture. In 1638, the colony of Delaware was founded. First founded by the Swedes, the territory known as New Sweden was taken by the Dutch in 1655 and conquered by England in 1664. Delaware briefly became part of Pennsylvania, but became independent as its own colony in 1704. It played an important role in terms of trade and agriculture. Virginia was founded at Jamestown in 1607 and became America's first permanent English colony. Virginia developed an economy based largely on agriculture, and crops such as tobacco became the economic foundation of this colony. Also, the first slaves were brought to Virginia in 1619. In 1632, the colony of Maryland was founded by Lord Baltimore George Calvert. Maryland was founded to meet the Catholics' quest for religious freedom. Maryland had a social structure that encouraged religious tolerance and was characterized by an agricultural economy, especially tobacco production. In 1663, the colony of Carolina was founded by England and initially covered a large territory. In 1729, the territory was divided into two separate colonies, North and South Carolina. Carolina became known for its agriculture and plantation economy. South Carolina was especially known for its rice and indigo production, while North Carolina was more known for tobacco and other agricultural products. In 1732, the colony of Georgia was founded by James Oglethorpe and was intended as a refuge for debtors. It also functioned as a defensive fortress on Britain's border with Spanish Florida. Georgia played an important role in terms of agriculture and especially sugarcane production. It was also established as a colony for defense and social reform. The central colonies were diverse in terms of agriculture, trade, and artisanal activities. The southern colonies were largely based on agriculture, especially large plantations. While the southern colonies were known for their social hierarchies and systems of slavery, the middle colonies developed more cosmopolitan structures that accommodated diverse ethnic and religious communities. The middle and southern colonies developed their own systems of local government. For example, the House of Burgesses in Virginia and local assemblies in other colonies played important roles in regional governance. In the 17th century, the development of the middle and southern colonies played an important role in shaping the social, economic, and political structure of North America. These colonies became important centers in early American history and contributed to the formation of American identity. In the 17th century, the backcountry in North America referred to the rural and mostly unsettled regions that extended inland from the eastern shores of the British colonies. Although the term became more widely used, especially in the 18th century, such regions were also developing in the 17th century. Here is some information about the 17th century Low Countries. The Low Country encompasses the rural areas east of the Appalachian Mountains, far from the densely settled areas of the English colonies on the East Coast. Parts of the present-day states of Pennsylvania, Virginia, and North Carolina fall under this definition. These areas were often mountainous, forested, and sparsely settled. While the soils were often fertile, development was slow due to transportation difficulties and lack of infrastructure. Settlements in the Ard country usually consisted of small villages or farms. Immigrants came to these areas in the hope of farming and owning land. Many of these settlements were shaped through interaction and trade with Native Americans. The population in these areas was often made up of immigrants and small farmers. Many came from England, Scotland, Ireland, and other European countries. Some indigenous peoples and slaves also continued to live in these areas. The Ard country had an economy based on agriculture. Settlers grew grain, corn, potatoes, and vegetables. Forest products and hunting were also part of the economic activity. These regions had limited trade with the more developed cities on the East Coast. Inland produce was transported to ports and urban centers on the East Coast. Ard country communities were generally self-sufficient, independent, and isolated. Education, religion, and social activities were often organized by the local community. The culture in these areas was a combination of traditions brought by immigrants from Europe and indigenous cultures. Local customs and practices shaped the identity of these communities. In the Ard country, transportation difficulties limited the development of these regions. Mountainous and forested terrain made it difficult to build roads and other infrastructure. Settlements in these regions interacted with Native Americans on various levels. There were conflicts and disputes, but also trade and exchanges. During the 18th century, further settlement and infrastructure development of the Ard country began. Expanding beyond the Appalachian Mountains, these regions developed rapidly until the American Civil War. The 17th century Low Country was a region where the foundations for settlement and economic development in rural and interior North America were laid. Despite the harsh conditions, settlers in these regions created their own communities and contributed to the expansion of American society. As the British colonies in America developed and strengthened, especially in the 18th century, Britain's wars with the French and Spanish had a major impact on the colonies. These wars became a clash of colonial ambitions in North America linked to the balance of power in Europe. Here is detailed information about these wars. In the 18th century, Britain and France were struggling for expansion and control in North America. France had a strong presence in Canada, Louisiana, and around the Mississippi River, while Britain coveted these territories with colonies on the East Coast. The war took place both in Europe and in North America, especially between Britain and France in North America. The war is commonly known as the 7 Years' War. Important conflicts in North America include the Battle of Fort Duquesne in 1754 and the Battle of Quebec in 1759. These battles helped Britain consolidate its supremacy in the region, The British colonies actively participated in the war, especially with militias and regular British soldiers. The French responded by forming an alliance with the Native Americans. The war ended with the Treaty of Paris. As a result of the treaty, France ceded Canada and the lands east of the Mississippi River to Britain. Spain gave Florida to Britain, and France ceded Louisiana to Spain. Britain's territory in North America expanded. But the financial burden of the war and the administration of the new territories led Britain to increase its policies of taxation and control over the colonies. This set the stage for the American Revolution. The French and Indian War of 1754 to 1763 was the North American version of the 7 Years' War and is often seen as a struggle between Britain and France for supremacy over India, the Caribbean, and the colonies in North America. Britain's expansionist efforts against French territories in North America were one of the main causes of the war. Conflicts, especially in the Ohio Valley, led to the outbreak of the war. The British colonies contributed greatly to the war, and various taxes were imposed to finance the war. Britain won important victories against the French in North America. France's influence in North America came to an end, and England consolidated its dominance in the region. Tensions between the Spanish and English colonies intensified, especially over lands in Florida and Mexico. Competition between Spanish and British interests led to conflicts in the border regions of North America. Conflicts between Spanish and British colonies were less intense. However, towards the end of the 18th century, Spain defended most of Florida against Britain. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 included many territorial boundary adjustments, and Spanish territories continued to be on the defensive against British dominance in North America. These wars encouraged tighter British control and taxation policies towards the colonies. This triggered the independence movements of the American colonies. Britain's post-war tax and administrative policies set the stage for the American Revolution. The colonies accelerated their quest for independence. These wars determined the rivalry between the British, French, and Spanish powers in North America and led to important developments that influenced the course of American history. After the wars with the French and Spanish powers, relations between the British colonies in America and the British Empire changed dramatically, setting the stage for the American Revolution. Here are the details of how these relationships were shaped. The 7 Years' War, French and Indian War, and other wars were a huge financial burden for the British Empire. Financing the war put Britain under high debts. Britain imposed stricter taxes and economic regulations on the colonies to ease the financial burden of the war and pay off its debts. Laws such as the Sugar Act of 1764 and the Stamp Act of 1765 caused widespread discontent in the colonies. After the war, the British Empire sought to establish tighter control over the administration of the colonies in North America. This included, in particular, regulations on the administration and demarcation of new lands. The British government declared a proclamation line limiting new colonist settlements west of the Appalachian Mountains. This was intended both to protect indigenous peoples and to maintain Britain's administrative authority. England passed various trade laws to control the colonies' foreign trade. These laws stipulated that the colonies could only trade through British ships and ports. Trade restrictions and high taxes imposed on the colonies began to create economic difficulties and led to discontent among the colonies. The colonies organized various protests against Britain's increasing control and taxation policies. These protests included events such as the Boston Riots 1773 and the Boston Tea Party. During this period, intellectuals and leaders in the colonies began to advocate for independence from Britain. These movements encouraged ideas of independence. With the proclamation line, Britain intended to establish more peaceful relations with indigenous peoples. However, this policy led to tensions as it hindered the colonists' desire to expand. The colonies began to develop a common position in the face of increasing British pressure. This led to the need for greater unity and coordination, which strengthened the independence movements. The British Empire's policies of tighter control and higher taxation of the colonies led to widespread discontent in the colonies. This set the stage for the outbreak of the American Revolution in 1775. The colonies declared their independence in 1776, separating from the British Empire and forging their own path as an independent nation. This process led to a deterioration in relations between the British Empire and the American colonies, and eventually to the rise of independence movements. British trade laws had a significant impact on the American colonies. They had a profound impact on the economic and social structure of the colonies and led to strained relations between the colonies and the British Empire. Here are the details of these impacts. England passed several navigation acts starting in 1651. These laws stipulated that British colonies could only trade with British ships or with other British colonies. The Navigation Acts of 1660 and 1663 specifically restricted colonial trade to England and England's colonies and aimed to transfer the revenues from this trade to England. The Sugar Act imposed new taxes on sugar, coffee, wool, and some other products in the colonies. It also tightened customs controls to prevent smuggling. The act caused economic hardship in the colonies and particularly affected sugar and molasses producers. This caused discontent in the colonies. The Stamp Act introduced a stamp duty on official documents, newspapers, and other printed materials. This law made it mandatory for all official business and trade-related documents to be stamped. It caused a huge backlash in the colonies because this law increased the financial burden on economic and legal transactions and created great discomfort among the people. The Tea Act required the East India Company to sell tea to the colonies at low prices. However, this did not give the colonies a chance to compete. The Tea Act caused major protests, such as the Boston Tea Party. The colonies made it clear that they did not accept British commercial pressure and economic control. The trade laws restricted the colonies from trading with other countries and increased trade dependence on Britain. This limited economic diversification in the colonies and aimed to protect Britain's economic interests. The taxes imposed by Britain increased the cost of business and trade in the colonies. This led to economic hardship and financial distress in the colonies. Trade laws and taxes encouraged illegal trade. The colonies developed secret trade routes and methods to ease the economic burden of these laws. Trade laws caused great discontent in the colonies. The colonies argued that these laws were unfair and harmed their economic interests. Taxes and trade restrictions led to various protests and popular movements in the colonies. These movements laid the groundwork for the American Revolution. The colonies began to violate Britain's trade laws, which led to conflicts between Britain and the colonies. British trade laws significantly affected the economic structure and social dynamics of the American colonies. These laws led to economic and social discontent in the colonies and played an important role in the process leading to the American Revolution. In the struggle for independence, the colonies took a stance opposing these regulations and defending their freedom of trade. The organization of the American Revolution against the British Empire was shaped by a combination of many social, economic, and political factors. The colonies developed various strategies and forms of organization for the struggle for independence. Here is detailed information about the organizing process of the American Revolution. In the late 1760s and early 1770s, large-scale protests began in the colonies against British tax and trade laws. Laws such as the Sugar Act 1764, the Stamp Act 1765, and the Tea Act 1773 caused widespread discontent. This was one of the most important protests against Britain's trade policies. Colonists dumped British tea into the sea as it arrived in Boston Harbor. This action caused Britain to react harshly against the colonies. In 1774, the First Continental Congress was convened. This Congress was convened to coordinate and develop a common position among the colonies. The colonies discussed economic boycotts and other methods of resistance against Britain. The Second Continental Congress convened at the outbreak of war. This Congress became the central governing body of the American Revolutionary Movement. It appointed George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army and coordinated the war effort. The battles at Lexington and Concord in 1775 became the first armed conflicts of the American Revolution. These events marked the clear start of the struggle for independence. American revolutionaries adopted strategies such as guerrilla warfare and surprise attacks against the British. They also formed alliances with external allies, such as the French. An alliance with the French was formed to support America's struggle for independence. The Franco-American Treaty of Friendship and Commerce, signed in 1778, enabled the French to provide military and financial aid. Other European countries, such as the Netherlands and Spain, also provided limited support. This support boosted the morale of the American forces and made the war more sustainable. In 1776, the Declaration of Independence, drafted under the presidency of Thomas Jefferson, was adopted by Congress on July 4th. It declared the colonies' independence from the British Empire and set out important principles of fundamental rights and the legitimacy of government. In 1781, the Yorktown victory was one of the key events of the revolutionary process. The surrender of General Cornwallis in Virginia was the last major battle of the American Revolution and resulted in Britain losing the war. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris ended the war and Britain recognized American independence, ending British sovereignty over the Americas. The revolution marked the beginning of important social changes on issues such as slavery, women's rights, and relations with indigenous peoples. However, the problems of slavery and indigenous peoples were not fully resolved. The financial burden of the war weakened the American economy. However, with independence, a new economic structure and national economy were developed. The organization of the American Revolution enabled the colonies to wage a united and coordinated struggle against the British Empire. This process, combined with both internal and external support, played a critical role in the achievement of American independence. The process of wars and revolution between the British colonies in America and the British Empire underwent a major transformation towards the end of the 18th century. This process was shaped by various wars, political events, and social changes. Here is detailed information about this process. The French and Indian War took place in North America as part of the global rivalry between Britain and France. Britain's expansionist policies towards French territories in North America led to conflicts. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 enabled France to cede Canada and territories east of the Mississippi River to Britain. This expansion increased Britain's control over the colonies, and the financial burden of the war led to new taxes being imposed on the colonies. The battles at Lexington and Concord in 1775 marked the beginning of the American Revolution. These first armed conflicts gave impetus to the colonies' struggle for independence from Britain. Important periods of the war include the Battle of Bunker Hill 1775, the Battle of Saratoga 1777, and the Battle of Yorktown 1781. The victory at Saratoga secured the support of external allies such as the French, while the victory at Yorktown resulted in the British surrender. The First Continental Congress was convened to coordinate the colonies and develop a common strategy against Britain. The colonies discussed boycotts and other methods of resistance. The Second Continental Congress convened at the outbreak of war. It became the central governing body of the American Revolutionary Movement and appointed George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. The Declaration of Independence, drafted by Thomas Jefferson, was adopted by Congress on July 4, 1776. It declared the independence of the colonies from Britain and set out the basic principles of rights and the legitimacy of government. After independence, the Articles of Confederation, America's first constitution, was adopted in 1781. However, this constitution caused some problems due to the lack of a strong central government. France formed a formal alliance to support America's struggle for independence. This alliance provided military and financial support. The Netherlands and Spain also provided limited support. This support boosted the morale of the American forces and made the war sustainable. In the aftermath of the American Revolution, the form of government the United States would adopt was a major topic of debate. In the post-revolutionary period, the lack of a federal government and democratic developments are critical parts of the early history of the United States. Here is information about the developments and issues during this period. Following the American War of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, adopted in 1781, served as the first American Constitution. Instead of a strong central government, it gave a great deal of power to the independent states. The Articles of Confederation denied the central government important powers such as collecting taxes, creating a military force, and regulating trade. This left the central government ineffective and led to disharmony among the states. The central government's lack of power to collect taxes made it difficult to pay off the national debt. There were also conflicts between the states over trade and tariff regulations. Economic and trade disputes between states led to political instability. Competition and disagreements between the states made it difficult to create a unified national policy. In 1787, the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia convened to discuss the inadequacy of America's existing governmental structure and to draft a new constitution. The convention drafted a new constitution to give more power to the central government. It envisioned the creation of a strong executive, legislative, and judicial branches. The new constitution was adopted in Philadelphia in 1787 and came into force in 1789. It created a federal structure of government, balanced power between the states, and established principles for the protection of individual rights. The Constitution provided for the separation of powers between the executive president, legislative Congress, and judicial Supreme Court branches. It also regulated the division of powers between the states and the federal government. The Bill of Rights, adopted in 1791, protected individual rights and freedoms. The first 10 articles guaranteed basic rights such as freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and freedom of religion. By limiting the powers of the federal government over individuals, the Bill of Rights strengthened the foundations of a democratic society. The new Constitution clearly defined the division of power between the federal and state governments. While the states retained some powers, an effective government structure was established at the national level. The debates between Federalist and anti-Federalist groups led to the emergence of two main currents in American political life: Federalists and anti-Federalists. The Federalists advocated a strong central government, while the anti-Federalists supported greater autonomy for the states. The adoption of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights helped to mature the democratic structure in the United States, and important steps were taken to protect individual rights. The establishment of the federal government made it possible to increase centralized powers and maintain a national order. This reduced discrepancies between the states and ensured national unity. In the post-American Revolution period, the absence of a federal government and democratic developments shaped the main problems and solutions of the early United States. The limitations of the Articles of Confederation led to the need for a new constitution, and this process laid the foundations for American federalism and democratic structures. Events such as the creation of America's post-revolutionary Constitution, the Northwest Ordinance, and the Philadelphia Convention represent critical developments in the early United States. Here is detailed information about these events. The Philadelphia Convention of 1787 was convened in Philadelphia to discuss the inadequacies of the existing Articles of Confederation and to draft a new constitution. The convention was attended by 55 delegations from 12 states. Some of the key figures included James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and Benjamin Franklin. The convention drafted a constitution that advocated the establishment of a strong central government. It envisioned a separation of powers between the executive, legislative, and judicial branches and created a federal government structure. The Northwest Proclamation was adopted by Congress in 1787. It was the first legal document to regulate how the territory known as the Northwest Territory would be governed and settled. Events such as the creation of America's post-revolutionary Constitution, the Northwest Ordinance, and the Philadelphia Convention represent critical developments in the early United States. It dealt with this region, covering Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. The territory was initially to be administered by the federal government. Once a certain population level was reached, the territory could gain state status. The Declaration granted basic rights to the citizens of the territory and outlawed slavery. This was one of the first significant steps towards abolition in American history. Public lands were set aside to be used for education and other public services. The Northwest Ordinance laid the foundation for land management and statehood in the American West. It also provided a model for the politics of expansion. Because the Declaration outlawed slavery, it was considered an important step for the abolitionist movement in America. In 1789, the political and economic situation in the United States reflected the great changes and challenges the country faced after gaining independence. Politically, in 1789, the United States began to function under a new constitution. This was the year that America's first federal government was established and George Washington was inaugurated as its first president. The enactment of the Constitution in 1789 meant the creation of a strong central government and a clear division of power between the states and the national government. There was a separation of power between the executive, legislative, and judicial branches, and the powers of the federal government were balanced with those of the state governments. The change brought about by this new governance structure caused controversy in some states and among the people. But overall, the Constitution provided greater stability in the governance of the nation. Economically, America in 1789 was facing many challenges. The financial burden of the War of Independence had led to a huge national debt. In addition, the lack of powers of the central government to collect taxes and regulate trade under the Articles of Confederation had led to a breakdown of economic order and trade disputes between the states. This made it difficult to stabilize the national economy and hindered economic development. Although some progress was made in agriculture and settlements, the national economy had to struggle with local problems and debts. These economic problems posed a major challenge for the first government officials and were being addressed with the implementation of the new Constitution. During this period, fundamental changes in America's political structure and economic problems played a decisive role in the future development of the country and, together with government reforms, led to the search for long-term stability. Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson played important roles in shaping the government during George Washington's presidency, but there were marked differences in their understanding and approach to government. Alexander Hamilton served as Washington's first Secretary of the Treasury and argued that the central government should have a strong fiscal and economic structure. Hamilton proposed the creation of a national bank to ensure the country's financial stability. This bank was designed to manage the federal government's debt and ensure the country's monetary union. He also advocated that the federal government should assume state debts and impose tariffs to support trade in the country. Hamilton's views were intended to increase the economic and financial power of the federal government, and this led to the centralization of government. Thomas Jefferson, on the other hand, served as Washington's Secretary of State and favored a more limited central government. Jefferson advocated greater autonomy of the states and the protection of individual rights. He opposed the creation of a national bank because he thought it would increase the powers of the federal government and jeopardize the autonomy of the states. Jefferson advocated a more agrarian economy and the preservation of rural society and favored limited trade and industrial development. Jefferson's vision aimed for a structure in which the central government was more limited and local governments more powerful. The differences between these two leaders led to a wide debate over the structure and economic policies of the federal government. Hamilton's centralist approach strengthened the federal government, while Jefferson's limited government emphasized state autonomy and individual rights. These differences played an important role in shaping early American political history, and the ideological clashes between the two leaders contributed to laying the foundations of the American political party in the following decades. The Whiskey Rebellion was a rebellion that occurred in the United States in the late 1790s. In 1791, Alexander Hamilton introduced a whiskey tax to improve the federal government's finances. This tax was seen as a huge burden, especially by small-scale farmers and whiskey producers in the western regions. Because these farmers were able to market their grain by turning it into whiskey, the tax made their financial situation more difficult. The uprising that broke out in Pennsylvania in 1794 was started by a group that rejected the tax and opposed the powers of the government. The uprising led to violent clashes, and Washington mobilized the army to put down the rebellion. The rebellion was an important test of the federal government's authority and demonstrated the government's ability to enforce its laws. The Jay Treaty was a treaty signed between the United States of America and Great Britain in 1794. Negotiated by John Jay, it aimed to reduce diplomatic tensions and regulate trade relations between the two countries. The treaty stipulated that Britain would withdraw its troops from America's western territories and limit British merchant ships' access to American ports. It also allowed America to trade with Britain and eased British restrictions on American ships. However, some critics argued that the treaty did not adequately protect Americans' maritime and trade rights and did not ensure Britain's complete withdrawal from some territories. The Jay Treaty is considered one of the first major international agreements in American history and played an important role in both American domestic politics and international relations. The presidency of Thomas Jefferson, 1801 to 1809, marked one of the major turning points in the early United States. Jefferson adopted a democratic-republican approach, aiming to limit the powers of the central government and increase the autonomy of the states. During his presidency, he tried to balance the federal budget by reducing government spending and taxes. Jefferson realized the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. This treaty doubled the territory of the United States, leading to a major expansion of the country to the west. The Louisiana Purchase was an important move in support of Jefferson's policies of expansion and agriculture. Jefferson's administration also faced international challenges such as the Barbary Wars. These were conflicts involving attacks on American merchant ships by Barbary pirates in North Africa. Jefferson tried to solve these problems through naval forces and was successful in using American military power in this region. Jefferson took many steps to limit federal powers and preserve state autonomy. However, the expansion of the federal government and some constitutional debates during his presidency pushed the limits of his ideological line. During this period, Jefferson's administration helped shape American history through America's territorial expansion and strategic moves in international relations. In the 19th century, the United States policy of neutrality was implemented in order to protect national interests and to avoid the effects of wars, especially in Europe. During this period, America's effort to remain neutral was particularly evident during the Napoleonic Wars and the conflicts between Britain and France. While America traded with both Britain and France, it developed various strategies to avoid being involved in the wars and the restrictions imposed by these countries on their sea routes. The Embargo Act, signed by President Thomas Jefferson in 1807, aimed to restrict America's international trade, particularly with Britain and France. Jefferson developed it as a response to British practices of intercepting American ships and detaining their crews. It prohibited American ships from sailing to foreign ports, especially those of countries at war. Jefferson hoped that this strategy would increase economic pressure on Britain and France to change their aggressive policies toward American trade. However, the Embargo Act also had a negative impact on America's own economy. As American ports remained closed, there was a massive economic contraction, especially in the shipping and agricultural sectors. The disconnection of agricultural and other goods from foreign markets led to economic hardship and public discontent. Opponents of the act, especially businessmen and sailors in the New England region, were outraged by the economic losses. The law was repealed in 1809 during James Madison's presidency, during which time America's trade policy was reorganized. The failure of the Embargo Act demonstrated the need to develop more balanced and effective strategies in American foreign policy. Neutrality and trade policy continued to play an important role in American foreign policy in the following decades. The War of 1812 took place between the United States and Britain between 1812 and 1815. The main causes of the war included British practices of intercepting American merchant ships and forcibly detaining their crews, British support for Native American tribes, and violations of American maritime rights. In addition, America's desire for expansion in the Western territories and Britain's resistance to this expansion were also causes of the war. In the early years of the war, the United States suffered several military setbacks. Britain was unable to fully focus on America as most of the war was fought in Europe due to the Napoleonic Wars. However, in 1814, the British invaded Washington, D.C. and set fire to the White House. This was a traumatizing event for the American people. One of the turning points of the war was the Battle of New Orleans in 1815. American forces under the command of Andrew Jackson repulsed the British with an important victory. This battle actually took place after the end of the war, even though a peace treaty had already been signed between Britain and America. The War of 1812 ended with the Treaty of Ghent, signed in 1814. It provided a peace that preserved the pre-war borders and did not resolve the root causes of the war. However, the war strengthened American nationalism and national unity. Britain recognized America's international status and independence at the end of the war, and America consolidated its national identity and military capabilities as a result of the war. Jacksonian democracy was a political and social movement that developed during Andrew Jackson's presidency, 1829 to 1837. Jackson aimed to transform the previously elitist American political system into one in which the broad masses of the people were more involved. This period represents an approach that emphasizes democratic values and popular sovereignty. At the center of Jacksonian democracy was a more active participation of broad masses of people in the political process and a more people-oriented structure of government. Jackson advocated for the expansion of voting rights and reforms in electoral systems. During this period, in many states, all white men, not just landowners, became eligible to vote in elections. Jackson also adopted a practice known as the spoils system. In this system, elected politicians appointed their supporters to government positions. This practice introduced an approach to government functioning based on political patronage and party loyalty. Critics argued that this system reduced the effectiveness of government and replaced merit-based appointments with appointments based on political loyalty. Jacksonian democracy was also an important turning point in relations with Native American peoples. Jackson supported the forced removal of Native American tribes from their eastern lands to the west. This policy was particularly embodied in the Native American Removal Act of 1830, which led to the forced relocation of many native tribes. Overall, the Jacksonian democracy represents a period in American politics in which the people had a greater say, democratic values were strengthened. But at the same time, coercive policies were implemented against indigenous peoples. This was a period of significant changes and debates in the American political structure. The Monroe Doctrine is a foreign policy principle announced in 1823 by the President of the United States, James Monroe. It emphasized that Europe should not interfere in the political affairs of the American continent, and that America would not interfere in the internal affairs of Latin American countries that maintained their independence in its continental zone. The Monroe Doctrine stated that European attempts to establish new colonies or re-establish old ones would not be accepted in the Americas. The doctrine was based on two main principles. First, that Europe should not interfere with existing colonial arrangements in the Americas, and second, that America should not interfere in Europe's internal affairs. The Monroe Doctrine reflected America's quest for regional sovereignty and stability in the Western Hemisphere and became one of the pillars of American foreign policy. The Monroe Doctrine marked an important turning point in American foreign policy. It shaped America's diplomatic strategies both regionally and globally, with a particular aim of supporting the independence of Latin American countries and limiting European influence on the continent. This principle had a broad impact on American foreign policy in the following decades and was seen as an instrument of American imperialism in the 19th century. The Missouri Compromise was a treaty adopted by the United States Congress in 1820. This compromise aimed to have Missouri join the Union as a state that allowed slavery, while at the same time limiting the expansion of slavery in new states. The admission of Missouri as a slavery-permitting state increased northern free states' concerns about the spread of slavery. The compromise allowed Maine to join the Union as a free state, along with the admission of Missouri. This arrangement provided for the prohibition of slavery in areas north of the 36° 30' line of latitude. However, this compromise only lasted through the 1820s and 1830s, and while it temporarily resolved the debate over the spread of slavery, it did not fully resolve the debate over slavery in America in the long term. While the Missouri Compromise temporarily calmed tensions over slavery, debates over the limits and expansion of slavery deepened, leading to the outbreak of the American Civil War. In the Americas, wars with Native Americans began with the arrival of Europeans to North America in the 17th century and continued into the 19th century. These conflicts were often caused by European settlers' territorial expansion, the search for resources and interference in the habitats of indigenous peoples. Early wars began as English, French, and Spanish settlers sought to expand their territories. These conflicts were often related to the occupation of indigenous tribes' lands and the narrowing of hunting grounds. In the 18th century, especially during the French and 7 Years' War, indigenous peoples often fought on the side of European powers. In the 19th century, the United States policy of westward expansion intensified conflicts with Indians. During this period, laws such as the Native American Removal Act 1830 led to the forced removal of indigenous tribes from their lands to the west. This forced migration, known as the Trail of Tears, caused great suffering and loss to the Cherokees and other tribes. The battles were often fought between Native American resistance and military intervention by the U.S. government. Some of the major conflicts include the Tecumseh War, led by the Indian General Tecumseh, General Andrew Jackson's Wars, and the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876, known as Custer's Last Stand. These battles symbolize the resistance of indigenous peoples and illustrate the consequences of the American government's expansionist policies. As a result, the wars with the Indians posed serious threats to the cultural and physical existence of indigenous peoples during America's westward expansion. These wars often led to indigenous peoples losing their lands and becoming culturally extinct. The effects of these conflicts are recognized as an important and tragic part of American history. Settlement movements in the American Near West played an important role in the exploration and colonization of a vast area of land in the 19th century. The Western territories beyond the Mississippi were one of the main regions targeted during the Western expansion of the United States. This process was particularly accelerated by the Louisiana Purchase 1803. The lands beyond the Mississippi began to expand as the American government encouraged settlers and exploration of the region. The Oregon Trail was a main route used by American settlers in the mid-19th century. It stretched from Missouri to the Oregon Territory and was an important part of the westward migratory movement. Immigrants who followed the Oregon Trail often braved the long and arduous journey in search of farmland and new opportunities. They faced many challenges along the way, but the process had a significant impact on the colonization of the West. Mormons were followers of Mormonism, a Christian sect founded by Joseph Smith and later led by Brigham Young. In the 1830s, the Mormons were expelled from many territories, mainly because of their beliefs, and this led them to a massive migration movement to the west. Moving towards Utah in the mid-1840s, the Mormons established a new settlement beyond their existing enclave. Under the leadership of Brigham Young, they established a large farming community in the Salt Lake City area of Utah, which became the center of the Mormon settlers. These settlement movements contributed to the expansion of America's western territories and played an important role in the settlement of the West. However, this expansion was not without its challenges, such as the loss of indigenous peoples' lands and cultural destruction. These great westward migrations and settlement movements constitute an important part of American history. The annexation of Texas was a process carried out by the United States in 1845. Texas declared its independence from Mexico in 1836 and was established as an independent republic. But this independence faced both internal and external problems. Due to economic difficulties, ongoing border conflicts with Mexico and security concerns, the Republic of Texas opted for union with the United States. By the late 1830s, American settlers in Texas began to express a desire for union with the United States. In 1844, U.S. President John Tyler proposed a treaty favoring the annexation of Texas. However, this proposal was controversial for both domestic and foreign political reasons. Tyler's successor, James K. Polk, accelerated the process by supporting annexation. By supporting the annexation of Texas, Polk aimed to realize America's goal of westward expansion. In 1845, the U.S. Congress approved the annexation of Texas, which led to Texas joining the Union as the 28th state. Mexico did not recognize the annexation of Texas, which increased tensions between Mexico and the United States. Mexico did not recognize the Rio Grande River on the Texas border as the official border, leading to the Mexican-American War of 1846–1848. The annexation of Texas is considered an important step in the process of America's westward expansion and is considered as part of the expansionist policies in American history. Moreover, the annexation of Texas set the stage for the Mexican-American War and played an important role in determining the U.S.-Mexico border and reshaping regional balances. The Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848, was not a conflict between the United States and Mexico. The main causes of the war were the annexation of Texas by the United States in 1845 and border disputes. Mexico did not recognize the annexation of Texas, and tensions escalated when the Rio Grande River at the border was recognized by the United States as the official border. The war was an important stage in America's westward expansionist ambitions. The beginning of the war was triggered by American claims that Mexico had encroached on its territory in 1846. The United States achieved several important victories at the beginning of the war, with forces under General Zachary Taylor and General Winfield Scott. The war ended with the occupation of Mexico's capital, Mexico City, in 1847. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed in 1848, marked the official end of the war. It gave the United States California, New Mexico, and other Western territories, and ended Mexico's sovereignty over them. The United States paid Mexico millions for these territories and made Mexico relinquish all rights to them. The annexation of California saw a significant economic boom, especially with the discovery of gold in 1848. The gold discoveries brought massive immigration and economic development to the region. The annexation of New Mexico changed the demographic and cultural structure of the region and expanded America's western frontiers. This process played an important role in America's westward expansion and reshaped regional dynamics. The war and annexation is considered an important turning point in American history and was a critical step in America's expansion to the western borders of the continent. In America, struggles over slavery became a major social and political issue, especially in the 19th century. The abolitionist movement gained momentum in the early 19th century, and efforts to abolish slavery led up to the American Civil War. The abolitionist movement began to gain strength in the early 1830s, especially in the northern states. Leading activists such as William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass informed the public through magazines and speeches advocating abolition. The abolitionist movement became a broad social movement that emphasized the moral and human rights wrongs of slavery. The first major struggles over slavery intensified in the 1850s and 1860s. In the 1850s, legislation, notably the so-called Slavery Compromise, included laws regulating the expansion of slavery and the capture of runaway slaves. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 allowed for a referendum on whether slavery should be allowed in these territories, which led to the violent conflicts known as Bleeding Kansas. Tensions between abolitionist and pro-slavery groups were exacerbated by the election of Abraham Lincoln as president in 1860. Lincoln's policy of limiting the spread of slavery worried the Southern states, which seceded from the Union in 1861, forming the Confederate States of America. This secession led to the American Civil War, 1861 to 1865. One of the most important outcomes of the Civil War was the formal abolition of slavery. In 1863, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation abolished slavery in the Confederate States, but it took the adoption of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution in 1865 to abolish slavery throughout the country. The 13th Amendment outlawed slavery throughout the United States. The abolitionist struggles and the Civil War fundamentally changed the social structure and legal system in America. The abolition of slavery laid the groundwork for race relations and struggles for social equality in the country, but it also brought challenges to the fight against racism and inequality. The election of Abraham Lincoln as president in 1860 had a major and profound impact on the United States. Lincoln's election was met with a strong reaction, especially in the southern states, due to his abolitionist and reformist policies. As the candidate of the Republican Party, Lincoln had promised to limit the expansion of slavery into new states. This caused great concern in the pro-slavery southern states and led to a serious backlash against the coming to power of an anti-slavery administration in those states. These reactions to Lincoln's presidency led many southern states to secede from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America in 1861. This secession set the stage for the outbreak of the American Civil War. This Civil War, which began after Lincoln's election as president, led to major conflicts over issues such as slavery, states' rights, and the powers of the federal government. Lincoln's presidency was at the center of efforts to abolish slavery. His Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 freed slaves in Confederate states during the Civil War and changed the moral and political direction of the war. It made the abolition of slavery a war objective and strengthened the morale of the North. As a result, Lincoln's election as president led to fundamental changes in America's political and social structure. By triggering the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, he played a critical role in America's historical development. Lincoln's leadership was decisive in the struggles to preserve the unity of the country and to solve deep social problems such as slavery. Robert E. Lee is one of the most important American soldiers of the 19th century and is recognized as a leader of the Southern states. He was born in 1807 in Virginia. After graduating from the West Point Military Academy, he served in various positions in the United States Army. During the Mexican-American War, he stood out as a brave leader. In 1861, when the Civil War broke out, Lee refused to fight on the Union side and supported Virginia's decision to secede. He then became the main commander of the Confederate States South. Lee's strategic genius and military leadership led the South to many important victories, but ultimately led to the weakening and surrender of the Confederacy towards the end of the war. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant at the Court of Appomattox in 1865, which marked the end of the Civil War. Following the war, Lee took off his uniform and entered the field of education, becoming president of Washington College, now Washington and Lee University in Virginia. While Robert E. Lee is admired for his military skills and leadership, he is a controversial figure as an advocate for slavery and the Southern secession movement. During the post-war reunification process, he was considered an iconic figure in both North and South. Following the end of the American Civil War, the country entered a period of great reconstruction and recovery. The Civil War had caused great economic, social, and political devastation. Southern states had to cope with the devastating effects of the war. Their infrastructure, economy, and social structures were largely destroyed. The Reconstruction period began after the end of the war in 1865 and ended in 1877. During this period, Southern states were reintegrated into the Union and constitutional changes were made to abolish slavery. The 13th Amendment outlawed slavery. The 14th Amendment guaranteed the civil rights of former slaves, and the 15th Amendment removed barriers that restricted the right to vote based on race, color, and prior slavery status. However, the Reconstruction period was fraught with difficulties. The rebuilding of local governments in the southern states, economic restructuring, and the integration of the post-slavery society faced many social and political tensions. The Jim Crow laws, which perpetuated segregation and racism, perpetuated post-slavery discrimination in the South and failed to ensure equal rights for Black Americans. Economically, economic differences between North and South deepened. While the North accelerated the process of industrialization, the South had to cope with an agrarian-based economy. Moreover, new post-slavery socio-economic dynamics and ethnic tensions emerged in the post-war social structure. Following this period, America continued to struggle with racism and segregation, especially in the southern states, until the early 20th century. The post-Civil War period was an important turning point in the reshaping of America as a modern nation. The American Civil War had a significant impact on the birth of modern America. It reshaped the country's federal structure, social dynamics, and economic structure. First, the Civil War strengthened the powers of the federal government and limited the states' right to act independently. This solidified the foundations of American federalism, increasing the role of the central government in national affairs. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, adopted after the war, officially ended slavery and granted civil rights to Black Americans. These changes expanded America's democratic values, but in practice there were still many challenges to ending racism and discrimination. Economically, the Civil War accelerated the industrialization of the North and forced the restructuring of the South's agriculture-based economy. This caused long-term changes in America's economic structure and redefined the country's industrial and commercial centers. Socially, the Civil War profoundly affected post-slavery social dynamics. Black Americans continued to fight for equal rights and opportunities, and some progress was made. But problems of discrimination and social inequality persisted. These problems during the Reconstruction period were instrumental in reshaping America's social structure. As a result, the American Civil War led to fundamental changes in the country's legal, economic, and social structure and laid the foundations of modern America, strengthening the powers of the federal government, expanding democratic values, and transforming the economic structure. The dominance of industry and the rise of commerce in America occurred rapidly towards the end of the 19th century. After the end of the Civil War, the United States underwent a major economic transformation driven by the Industrial Revolution. Industry developed rapidly in the northern states, with a major growth in the railroads, textile mills, and heavy industry. During this period, large-scale factories and production facilities became the center of the economy. Railroads formed the backbone of this industrial growth. An extensive rail network facilitated the movement of goods and labor across the country and enabled the expansion of the domestic market. This transport network accelerated the movement of raw materials to production centers and final products to consumption areas, which contributed to increased trade and economic growth. Trade gained great momentum during this period. America became a major player in both domestic and international trade. Agricultural products, minerals, and industrial goods reflected the country's rich natural resources and production capacity. At the same time, the rise of large corporations and industrial barons led to the concentration of economic power in a few large organizations. Figures like Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Morgan gained great wealth and influence during this industrial revolution. Industrial dominance also had an impact on urbanization and labor mobility. Cities grew rapidly, and immigrants from rural areas flocked to the big cities to take advantage of the job opportunities that industrialization brought. This process radically changed America's social and economic structure. As a result, the dominance of industry and the rise of trade in America increased the country's economic power, helping to expand the national market and become a competitive player in international trade. This period laid the cornerstones of the modern American economy, allowing industry and commerce to spread across the country. In America, troops and monopolies gained great economic power in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These terms refer to monopolization and reduced competition in the market. With the Industrial Revolution, large-scale corporations and industrial barons expanded their economic dominance by using mergers and acquisition strategies to dominate the market. In the process, giant companies such as John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil, Andrew Carnegie's Carnegie Steel, and J.P. Morgan's Northern Securities Company gained significant market power. These large corporations adopted strategies to control prices and maximize profits, often by eliminating market competition. For consumers, this meant high prices and limited choice. The economic power of these monopolies also had profound effects on political influence and social structures. The U.S. government took several steps to regulate the economic pressures and negative effects of these monopolies and troops. The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 made these monopolies and mergers illegal. The law aimed to limit anti-competitive behavior, monopolistic practices, and market dominance. However, this law was initially not effectively enforced. Later, the Clayton Antitrust Act, passed in 1914, introduced a series of measures to address the shortcomings of the Sherman Act. The Clayton Act defined certain antitrust conduct in more detail and also introduced stricter regulations on mergers and acquisitions. It made it harder for large companies to monopolize the market and prevent competition. Nevertheless, the enforcement of antitrust laws depended on the government's capacity to regulate and control these large economic forces. Throughout the 20th century, at various periods, the government developed different strategies to combat monopolies and large corporations. In some periods, particularly during the Great Depression and the post-World War II period, these laws and regulations were more effectively enforced. As a result, the rise of trots and monopolies in America led to a concentration of economic power, and the government aimed to protect market competition by introducing regulations and laws against this monopolization. These regulations helped to make the American economy more balanced and competitive. In the 19th and 20th centuries, workers and immigrants played an important role in the economic and social structure of America. The Industrial Revolution and large migration movements during this period shaped the dynamics of American society and the structure of its labor force. In the late 19th century, the rapidly growing industrial sector in America increased the demand for labor. The working class contributed to economic growth by working in factories, mines, and construction projects. During this period, workers often faced long hours, low wages, and harsh working conditions. The labor rights and trade union movements developed as a reaction to these conditions. Unions allowed workers to fight for better working conditions and higher wages. Immigrants made up a large part of the American workforce during this period. Immigrants from various parts of Europe flocked to America's industrial centers, especially the factories in the big cities. These immigrants contributed to America's economic development, while at the same time increasing social and cultural diversity. Immigrants often worked in low-paying jobs and often faced poor living conditions. In the early 20th century, the labor rights movement and the plight of immigrant workers brought further reforms and regulations. In the early 1900s, there were regulations on issues such as worker safety and working hours. In the 1930s, government policies and social security programs were introduced to deal with unemployment and economic hardship during the Great Depression. The Social Security Act of 1935 and the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 aimed to protect workers' rights and improve living standards. Immigrants continued to play an important role later in the 20th century. Immigration policies changed from time to time, with more open admission in some periods and restrictions in others. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 reformed the immigration system and introduced an approach that took into account family reunification and labor needs. In conclusion, in the 19th and 20th centuries, workers and immigrants made major contributions to America's economic growth and social fabric. These periods witnessed significant changes in the development of labor rights, social reforms, and the evolution of immigration policies. In the 19th century, the American West experienced great economic and social change. Westward expansion was an important part of American history, and sectors such as mining and animal husbandry played a decisive role in this process. The development of the West accelerated, especially in the 1840s. The discovery of gold and silver led to a massive influx of immigrants to the region. The Gold Winter, which began with the discovery of gold in California in 1848, brought hundreds of thousands of miners to the region. Mining rapidly transformed the economic structure of the West and led to the formation of new cities and communities. However, mining activities led to environmental destruction and conflicts with Native American communities. There were frequent disputes and violence between miners and indigenous people. Livestock also played an important role in the economic development of the West. By the mid-19th century, large herds of cattle were being raised, especially in Texas and the surrounding states. Livestock became a cornerstone of the region's economy, and large-scale herd movements became a cultural symbol of the American West. Cattle ranching was supported by the expansion of railroads, which facilitated the transportation of livestock to markets and accelerated the agricultural and economic integration of the West. These economic opportunities encouraged migration to the West, but this process came with both environmental and social problems. Indigenous peoples lost their lands, and their cultural and social structures suffered greatly during this process of expansion. In addition, mining and livestock activities depleted the natural resources in the region and caused environmental problems. As a result, Western development in the 19th century was shaped by sectors such as mining and animal husbandry. This process transformed the economic and social structure of the West, but it also led to environmental and social problems. In 19th century America, farmers were the cornerstones of the agricultural society, but they faced various challenges. Farmers' problems were often related to economic hardship, debt burden, and natural disasters. The fall in the prices of agricultural products, especially in the 1870s and 1880s, had a significant impact on farmers' incomes. Prices of agricultural products fell, costs rose, and farmers were burdened by debt. The agricultural revolution refers to the technological and productive changes in agriculture in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. During this period, new agricultural machinery, chemical fertilizers, and improved irrigation techniques increased agricultural productivity. The agricultural revolution significantly increased the efficiency of agriculture, enabling farmers to produce more crops and use their land more effectively. In addition, the widespread adoption of modern agricultural practices eased the workload of farmers and brought about a major transformation in the agricultural sector. The organization of farmers enabled them to act collectively against their problems. Agricultural unions and cooperatives were established to voice farmers' problems and seek solutions. One of the most important farmer organizations was the Grange movement, founded in 1867. The Grange provided training and support to farmers while also helping to market agricultural products and improve economic conditions. In addition, the Populist Party was founded in the 1890s to strengthen the representation of farmers. The Populists advocated economic reforms and agricultural support policies. In 1896, American farmers felt the effects of the policies and reforms advocated by the Populist Party in particular. In this year, farmers' problems and economic woes came to the fore in the presidential elections and political debates. The Populist Party's presidential candidate, William Jennings Bryan, ran a campaign that articulated the problems of farmers and fought against economic inequalities. However, Bryan's electoral failure showed that farmers' search for solutions was limited and that they needed broader political and economic reforms. In conclusion, American farmers in the 19th century faced economic and natural challenges, but fought back through the agricultural revolution and organizing. Farmers organizing supported their efforts to defend their economic and political rights, but they faced many challenges in the process. In the early 20th century, the political environment in the United States was in a period of great change and transformation. It was a time when America was emerging from the Industrial Revolution to become a modern nation. Significant changes in the political landscape were particularly marked by the rise of the progressive movement. Progressivism included a series of reforms that focused on issues such as anti-corruption, protecting workers' rights, women's rights, and economic inequality. This movement advocated for a more active role for the government and social justice. Progressivism was supported by many reformist leaders, notably President Theodore Roosevelt and later President Woodrow Wilson. In the political environment of this period, labor movements and union activities gained importance, especially in large cities and industrial areas. Workers fought for improved working conditions, better wages, and union rights. This process led to the development of labor rights and social security reforms. America's foreign policy also underwent a significant change during this period. The late 19th century expansionist policies became more pronounced at the beginning of the 20th century. America began to play a more active role in the international arena and shaped its policies towards colonial administrations, particularly in the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. At the same time, social and cultural changes also took place during this period. Women's movements, women's suffrage, and demands for social equality came to the fore. The 19th Amendment to the Constitution, which granted women the right to vote in 1920, was considered one of the most important achievements of this movement. In conclusion, the American political environment in the early 20th century was shaped by progressive reforms, labor movements, foreign policy shifts, and social changes. This period is considered an important stage in America's modernization process. Theodore Roosevelt played an important role as America's president in the early century and was known for his square deal policy. Roosevelt's Fair Deal policy was based on three main principles to correct economic inequality and social injustices, protect users, promote labor rights, and regulate corporations. Roosevelt introduced reforms to limit the market power of big business and monopolies. In this framework, he ensured effective enforcement of the Sherman Antitrust Act and supported antitrust litigation by big business. He also supported legislation to improve workers' rights, such as the Fair Labor Standards Act. In the area of consumer protection, Roosevelt took important steps in food and drug regulation following the publication of The Jungle in 1906. In response to the food safety issues raised by this book, Roosevelt established the Food and Drug Administration, FDA, and ensured that food products met health standards. Roosevelt's Fair Deal policy reflected a belief in the necessity of government intervention to achieve social justice and redress economic inequalities. This policy is considered a period in which Roosevelt argued that the government should actively intervene in economic and social problems. The late 19th century Spanish-American War took place in 1898 between the United States and Spain. One of the reasons for the war was the growing American support for the struggle for Cuban independence against Spanish rule. The uprisings against the Spanish rule in Cuba and the pressure created by the American public opinion in this process paved the way for the outbreak of the war. Another factor leading to America's declaration of war was the explosion of the American battleship USS Maine in Havana Harbor in 1898. Following this incident, the American public and government suggested that the explosion was caused by Spanish sabotage, and calls for war increased. As a result, America declared war on Spain. The war was short and ended in an American victory. Spain was forced to recognize Cuba's independence, and America gained the Spanish colonies of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. In the Philippines, the onset of American rule led to conflicts that continued with the struggle for Philippine independence. The war established America as a powerful military power in the international arena and marked the beginning of America's overseas colonial policy. The open door policy and the Roosevelt policy are important approaches that reflect America's strategies and interventionist policies in international relations. The open door policy is a foreign policy principle formulated by U.S. Secretary of State John Hay in 1899. This policy argued that trade opportunities in China should be equally accessible to all nations. It opposed the establishment of privileged economic zones in China by the great powers with territorial influence in China, notably Britain, Germany, France, Japan, and Russia, and demanded free trade access to China for all countries. The open door policy aimed to protect China's sovereignty and aimed to balance the influence of the great powers on China. The Roosevelt policy is a foreign policy principle introduced by President Theodore Roosevelt in 1904. It asserted America's authority for economic and military intervention in Latin America. The Roosevelt policy extended the Monroe Doctrine, recognizing the right of the United States to intervene in cases of debt default in Latin America. This policy envisioned an active American role in stabilizing the region and emphasized the right of the United States to intervene in the internal affairs of Latin American countries. The Roosevelt policy aimed to increase American influence in Latin America and limit European influence in the region. Both policies played an important role in defining America's role and interventionist approach in the international arena. While the open door policy advocated free trade and international equality, the Roosevelt policy aimed to strengthen America's regional influence and interventionist authority. The Woodrow Wilson era covers the period between 1913 and 1921, when he served as the 28th President of the United States. Wilson's presidency was characterized by significant changes in both domestic and foreign policy. In domestic policy, Wilson's administration implemented progressive reforms. These reforms included the restructuring of the banking system, the creation of the Federal Reserve System, and regulation of large corporations. Wilson also increased the income tax, which allowed higher taxes to be levied on large income groups. The Clayton Antitrust Act, passed in 1914, aimed to limit the influence of corporations on the market and protect competition. Wilson's foreign policy approach is often described as moral diplomacy. This approach aimed to spread American values and democracy. Wilson's foreign policy believed that America should solve problems through diplomacy and international cooperation instead of wars. However, these idealistic policies were tested, especially during World War I. In 1917, the United States entered World War I. After the end of the war, Wilson presented the 14 Articles for Peace, which envisioned a just order in international relations. One of Wilson's most important goals was to establish the League of Nations. This organization was intended to provide a forum for the resolution of international conflicts. But due to the Senate's rejection of the resolution to join the League of Nations, America could not become a member of this organization. Wilson's term also saw social reforms such as women's suffrage. The 19th Amendment to the Constitution, adopted in 1920, gave women the right to vote in federal elections. In conclusion, the Woodrow Wilson era was characterized by significant reforms and changes in domestic and foreign policy. Domestically, economic and social reforms were undertaken, while externally, America's role and influence in international affairs was shaped. At the beginning of World War I, the United States adopted a policy of neutrality. At the outbreak of the war in 1914, President Woodrow Wilson argued for America to stay out of the war and maintain a neutral stance. Wilson believed that the war was between the powers in Europe and that America should not interfere in this conflict. This position was maintained both at the outbreak of the war and in its later years. However, America's neutrality ended due to several factors. First, Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare in naval warfare and attacks on American ships and commerce drew the ire of the American people and government. In particular, the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915 and the submarine attacks on American ships in 1917 forced America's policy of neutrality. Another important factor was the Zimmermann telegram sent by Germany to Mexico in this secret message. Germany promised to support Mexico in waging war against the United States, and in return, Mexico would get back the territories it had lost. The disclosure of the telegrams sparked outrage against Germany among the American people and government. As a result, the United States declared war in 1917 and joined the war on the side of the Allies. This decision marked the end of America's policy of neutrality and marked the period when it became a direct party to the war. America's participation in the war was an important factor affecting the course and outcome of the war. In the interwar period, the United States pursued a foreign policy often referred to as the policy of isolationism. This policy refers to America's post-World War I isolationism in international affairs and its focus on domestic affairs. After the end of World War I, a marked trend of isolationism emerged in American foreign policy. The devastating effects of the war and the losses of American soldiers created a public backlash against foreign intervention. America's non-participation in the League of Nations, established by President Woodrow Wilson for the post-war peace order, was the most prominent example of this isolationist attitude. By rejecting the resolution to join the League of Nations, the Senate prevented America from entering into international commitments. Throughout the 1920s, American foreign policy was largely focused on domestic economic development and social reform. During this period, America preferred to stay out of foreign conflicts and political disputes. This period between the two world wars was a time when America avoided involvement in the complex alliance systems in Europe and tensions in Asia. However, America was not completely isolated. In the 1920s and 1930s, it participated in international disarmament conferences such as the Washington Naval Treaties and concluded various economic and trade agreements. However, these engagements were often limited and took place within a framework that prevented America from making deep military or political commitments. The onset of the Great Depression in the 1930s further reinforced America's inward-looking policy. The economic crisis focused government and public attention on domestic problems and reinforced isolationist tendencies in foreign policy. During this period, America's foreign policy was often focused on economic recovery and efforts to achieve domestic stability. As a result, in the interwar period, America pursued an isolationist policy, avoiding foreign intervention and not entering into international commitments. However, this policy changed dramatically with the outbreak of World War II, and especially after the attack on Pearl Harbor. The Great Depression hit America hard, causing widespread economic distress across the country during the decade from 1929 to 1939. It began with the crash of the New York Stock Exchange in 1929 and quickly spread across the country. Millions of Americans lost their jobs, and unemployment rose as high as 25%, banks failed, and many people lost their savings. The agricultural sector also suffered greatly. Farmers were unable to sell their crops and lost their land because they could not pay their debts. Industrial production fell sharply. Factories closed and investment ground to a halt. Consumer demand fell, and many businesses went bankrupt. The crisis also had social and psychological effects. People who lost their homes and jobs experienced great despair and insecurity. The number of homeless people in cities increased, and so-called Hoovervilles or slums emerged. The federal government's response was initially inadequate. In the early years of the crisis, President Herbert Hoover believed that free market mechanisms would self-correct and made limited interventions. But as the situation worsened, more interventionist measures were taken. With the election of Franklin D. Roosevelt as president in 1933, a series of economic and social reforms known as the New Deal were launched. These reforms included measures such as restructuring banks, providing jobs for the unemployed through public works programs, creating a social security system, and protecting workers' rights. The New Deal accelerated economic recovery and instilled confidence in the American people, but full recovery was only possible with the economic revival brought about by World War II. As a result, the Great Depression deeply affected America economically, socially, and politically. It redefined the role of government in the economy and laid the foundations of the modern welfare state. Franklin D. Roosevelt was inaugurated as the 32nd President of the United States in 1933 and launched a wide-ranging set of economic and social reforms called the New Deal. With the aim of leading the country out of the Great Depression, the New Deal began with emergency measures that were quickly implemented within the first 100 days of Roosevelt's presidency and continued with longer-term reforms in the following years. Roosevelt's New Deal program included a series of laws and programs to reduce unemployment, promote economic recovery, and rebuild the confidence of the American people. A bank holiday was declared to stabilize the banking system, followed by the Glass-Steagall Act to regulate banks. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, was established to insure bank deposits, thus restoring confidence in banks. Public works programs were launched to combat unemployment. Programs such as the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, and the Works Progress Administration, WPA, provided jobs for millions of Americans and improved the country's infrastructure. These programs built roads, bridges, schools, and parks. In the agricultural sector, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, AAA, provided support to farmers. This law aimed to regulate agricultural production and increase farmers' incomes. In addition, the Rural Electrification Administration, REA, brought electricity to rural areas. The foundations of the Social Security system were also laid during this period. The Social Security Act created social safety nets such as pensions, unemployment insurance, and public assistance. This created a long-term sense of security in American society. The New Deal also strengthened workers' rights. The National Industrial Recovery Act, NIRA, and the Wagner Act recognized workers' rights to unionize and strengthened collective bargaining. These laws introduced fair regulations in labor management relations and improved working conditions. Under Franklin D. Roosevelt's leadership, the New Deal played an important role in the United States' recovery from the Great Depression. It succeeded in restoring public confidence through economic and social reforms and laid the cornerstones of the modern American state. The New Deal fundamentally changed America's approach to social security, workers' rights, and economic regulation, and Roosevelt's presidency is considered an important turning point in American history. When the Second World War began, the United States was in the process of economic and social recovery. When war broke out in Europe in 1939, the United States was still recovering from the effects of the Great Depression. But thanks to Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal programs, the economy had improved significantly. Unemployment fell, industrial production increased, and many Americans found work again. At the beginning of the war, America was officially neutral and pursued a policy of neutrality. The Neutrality Acts, passed in the 1930s, were designed to prevent direct U.S. involvement in the war. Most of the population tended to stay away from the conflicts in Europe, but Roosevelt knew that war in Europe could threaten America's security and interests. Roosevelt therefore sought ways to help the Allies within the framework of a policy of neutrality. With the passage of the Lend-Lease Act in 1940, America began to provide military supplies and support to Britain and other allies. This law ensured America's indirect involvement in the war and provided a great deal of aid to the Allies. America also increased its military preparations. In 1940, the first peacetime conscription was introduced, and the size of the army was increased. Industry was diverted to war production, and massive production of military vehicles, aircraft, and ships began. It was on December 7, 1941, with Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, that the war became a direct issue for America. This attack brought America into the war, which was followed by the declaration of war on Germany and Italy. In the aftermath of the attack, America switched to a full war economy and directed all its resources to the war effort. At the beginning of the Second World War, America had recovered economically, increased its military preparations, and tried to remain neutral. But with the attack on Pearl Harbor, America became directly involved in the war and began to play an active role on the world stage. America's defense of the Pacific in World War II began with Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. This attack severely damaged the American Navy and brought America into the war. After Pearl Harbor, America developed defensive and counteroffensive strategies in the Pacific region. Initially, America was in a defensive position in the Pacific. Japan quickly invaded American and Allied territories such as the Philippines, Guam, and Wake Island. American and Philippine forces fought a fierce defensive battle on the Bataan Peninsula and Corregidor Island, but were eventually forced to surrender. Despite these losses, American forces continued to defend strategic points in the Pacific. An important part of American strategy in the Pacific was the island-hopping tactic. This tactic aimed to bypass some of the islands controlled by Japan and seize the strategically important ones. In this way, American forces advanced into Japan step by step, eroding Japanese defenses without engaging in direct combat. In 1942, the Battle of Midway became one of the turning points of the war in the Pacific. America dealt a heavy blow to the Japanese Navy and halted Japan's expansion plans. This victory strengthened America's defenses in the Pacific and set the stage for its counterattacks. The Battle of Guadalcanal was one of the first major land attacks by American forces and took place in 1942 to 1943. It saw long and bloody battles between the American Marines and Japanese forces, but in the end, America captured Guadalcanal and took the initiative in the Pacific. In 1943 and 1944, American forces made successful landings in the Gilbert and Marshall Islands, the Mariana and Palau Islands. Victories in the Mariana Islands allowed the United States to launch airstrikes against the Japanese mainland. The battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa were some of America's largest and bloodiest engagements in the final stages of the war in the Pacific. At Iwo Jima, American forces captured strategic air bases, and at Okinawa, they carried out a major ground offensive near the south of Japan. Despite initial losses, the American defense in the Pacific advanced towards Japan with strategic strides and intense fighting. Island-hopping tactics and critical victories played an important role in America's ability to force Japan's eventual surrender. With the dropping of the atomic bombs and Japan's surrender in August 1945, the Pacific War ended. During the Second World War, America participated in major military campaigns in North Africa and Italy. Participation in the war in North Africa began with a major Allied amphibious operation known as Operation Torch, which began in 1942. American and British forces invaded Vichy French-controlled areas in Morocco and Algeria in November 1942. The battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa were some of America's largest and bloody. The aim of this operation was to clear North Africa of German and Italian forces and gain strategic superiority in the Mediterranean. Following Operation Torch, Allied forces moved eastward, targeting the German Afrika Korps in Tunisia. In the process, American forces suffered heavy losses in engagements such as the Battle of Kasserine Pass, but soon recovered and began to make gains against German and Italian forces. In May 1943, the German and Italian troops in Tunisia surrendered and North Africa came fully under Allied control. After victory in North Africa, the Allies began their campaign against Italy in July 1943. The Sicilian landings, known as Operation Husky, began when American and British forces launched a major amphibious and airborne assault on Sicily. The fighting in Sicily was fierce against German and Italian defenses, but the Allies captured the island in August 1943. The capture of Sicily paved the way for the invasion of Italy. In September 1943, the Allies landed on the Italian mainland and carried out a major operation at Salerno. At the same time, the fascist government of Benito Mussolini was overthrown in Italy, and the new Italian government signed an armistice agreement with the Allies. However, German forces quickly established themselves in the north and center of Italy and attempted to halt the Allied advance. The war in Italy was a long and difficult process. Fierce fighting took place at strategic points such as Monte Cassino, and the Allies gradually advanced northward. In June 1944, Rome was captured, but German resistance continued. In late 1944 and early 1945, the Allies continued successful operations in northern Italy, and in April 1945, German forces finally surrendered. America's battles in North Africa and Italy were critical to the final victory in Europe. Success in North Africa established control of the Mediterranean Sea and provided a strategic basis for the invasion of Italy. Progress in Italy weakened German forces and opened an important front for the final Allied offensive against Germany. Victories on these fronts contributed significantly to the broader strategic picture of the war in Europe. During the Second World War, America won major victories in both Europe and the Pacific and made important contributions that determined the outcome of the war. In Europe, American forces, working with their allies, defeated Nazi Germany. In the Pacific, they fought against Japan, winning victory and securing peace in Asia. The victories in Europe began with the Normandy landings. On June 6, 1944, in an operation known as D-Day, American, British and Canadian forces landed on the Normandy coast of France. This massive and complex operation began the liberation of Western Europe. After Normandy, the Allies advanced rapidly, liberating Paris and continuing their advance into Germany. The Ardennes Offensive, Battle of the Bulge, was the last major German counterattack faced by American forces. At the end of 1944, the Germans launched an offensive in the Ardennes region of Belgium, but thanks to American resistance and counterattacks, the offensive was repulsed. This victory accelerated the Allied advance on the Western Front. In April 1945, American and Soviet forces met at the Elbe River and merged in central Germany. On May 8, 1945, the war in Europe ended with Germany's surrender. This victory symbolized the determination and success of America and its allies to liberate Western Europe from Nazi occupation and defeat Germany. Victories in the Pacific began with the Battle of Midway. In June 1942, the American Navy won a major victory over the Japanese Navy and halted Japan's expansion in the Pacific. This battle was an important turning point that changed the course of the war. With the island-hopping strategy, American forces advanced step by step towards Japan. Victories on islands such as Guadalcanal, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa weakened Japanese defenses and brought the Americans closer to mainland Japan. The victories on Iwo Jima and Okinawa gave American forces strategic air bases and allowed them to launch direct attacks on Japan. In August 1945, America dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These bombings accelerated Japan's surrender, and on August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered unconditionally. This victory ended the Pacific War and brought peace in Asia. American victories in Europe and the Pacific played a decisive role in the end of the Second World War. By defeating Nazi Germany in Europe and Japan in the Pacific, it restored peace and security around the world. These victories demonstrated America's military power and strategic capabilities and cemented its position as world leader in the post-war period. The Cold War was a period of ideological, political, economic and military competition between the United States and the Soviet Union that began after the Second World War and lasted for nearly 45 years. It was characterized by proxy wars, espionage, propaganda and economic competition, avoiding direct military confrontation. The beginning of the Cold War is generally recognized as 1945 to 1947. During this period, serious disagreements emerged between the US and the Soviets over the reconstruction and future of Europe. The US launched the Marshall Plan to support the economic recovery of Western European countries. This plan was rejected by the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc countries, deepening the economic divide between the two blocs. In 1947, US President Harry Truman declared the Truman Doctrine against Soviet expansion and promised economic and military aid to countries resisting communism. In the same year, the Marshall Plan came into force, and Western European countries began to recover rapidly. The Soviets consolidated their control in Eastern Europe and established communist regimes there. Berlin became the center of one of the first major crises of the Cold War. During the Berlin blockade of 1948 to 1949, the Soviets cut off all land access to West Berlin. The United States and its allies broke the blockade by airlifting food and supplies to West Berlin. In 1949, the Federal Republic of West Germany and the Democratic Republic of East Germany were established, officially dividing Germany in two. In 1949, the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb, thus ending the US monopoly on nuclear weapons. This started the nuclear arms race, and both superpowers began to produce large quantities of nuclear weapons. Between 1950 and 1953, the Korean War became the first major hot conflict of the Cold War. North Korea's communist regime was supported by the Soviets and China, while South Korea was supported by the United States and the United Nations. In the late 1950s, the space race began. In 1957, the Soviet Union took the first step in the space race by launching Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite. In 1961, during the presidency of John F. Kennedy, the United States launched the Apollo program, aiming to land humans on the moon. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 was one of the most dangerous moments of the Cold War. The Soviets installed nuclear missiles in Cuba, and the United States considered it an act of war. The crisis ended with both sides backing down and seeking a diplomatic solution. But the world came back from the brink of nuclear war. In the 1960s and 1970s, the Vietnam War became one of the major conflicts of the Cold War. The US launched a major military intervention to stop communist expansion in South Vietnam, but the war eventually ended in a North Vietnamese victory. In the 1970s, a period of détente between the US and the Soviet Union began. The SALT Strategic Arms Limitation Talks agreements were signed, aiming to control nuclear weapons. In the 1980s, during Ronald Reagan's presidency, the Cold War intensified again. Reagan described the Soviet Union as an empire of evil and increased military spending. Projects such as the Strategic Defense Initiative Star Wars aimed to gain the upper hand against the Soviet Union. In 1985, when Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in the Soviet Union, the policies of glasnost openness and perestroika restructuring were launched. These reforms aimed to liberalize and economically revitalize the Soviet system, but also encouraged democratic movements in the Eastern Bloc. In 1989, communist regimes in Eastern Europe rapidly collapsed, and the Berlin Wall fell. In 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolved, and the Cold War ended. As the winner of the Cold War, the United States consolidated its global supremacy and remained the world's sole superpower. After the Second World War, the US domestic politics underwent significant transformations. With the end of the war, the US economy grew rapidly, and major changes took place in American society. This period, which lasted from 1945 to the 1960s, saw many political, economic, and social developments. In the post-war period, America experienced a huge economic boom. Returning soldiers and the transition from a war industry to a peace economy created a huge demand. During this period, demand for consumer goods increased and the housing sector grew rapidly. The law known as the GI Bill provided education and housing loans to war veterans, which contributed to the expansion of the middle class and the development of suburbs. Under President Harry Truman, social reforms were attempted through the Fair Deal program. This program included goals such as the expansion of the Social Security system, full employment policies, and civil rights reforms. However, many of these reforms were not fully realized due to conservative resistance in Congress. In the 1950s, anti-communist movements gained strength in US domestic politics under the influence of the Cold War. Under the leadership of Senator Joseph McCarthy, during the period known as McCarthyism, many people were accused of being communists and witch hunt-like investigations were carried out. This created great fear and paranoia in American society. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, the civil rights movement gained great momentum. African Americans began to fight against Jim Crow laws and for equal rights. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., spearheaded the civil rights struggle with peaceful protests and acts of civil disobedience. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were important achievements of this movement and played a major role in outlawing discrimination. In the 1960s, President John F. Kennedy's New Horizons program aimed to gain the upper hand in the space race against the Soviet Union. After Kennedy's assassination, President Lyndon B. Johnson launched the Great Society program. This program included goals such as fighting poverty, reforming education, and expanding health care. Important health programs such as Medicare and Medicaid were implemented during this period. In the late 1960s and 1970s, the Vietnam War created a major controversy in U.S. domestic politics. Anti-war movements were supported by young people and civil society. The Tet Offensive in 1968 greatly reduced American public support for the war. In the same period, assassinations and urban riots caused great unrest in American society. In the 1970s, during the administration of President Richard Nixon, the Watergate scandal broke out. Nixon was forced to resign in 1974 after the scandal broke. This caused a major loss of trust in American politics and led to political reforms. Congress passed laws restricting the president's powers and introduced transparency measures. In the 1980s, conservative policies gained strength under President Ronald Reagan. Economic policies, known as Reaganomics, included cutting taxes, cutting government spending, and promoting a free market economy. These policies stimulated economic growth, but also increased income inequality. These transformations in U.S. domestic politics in the post-World War II period played a major role in shaping American society. Economic growth, social reforms, the civil rights movement, and political scandals profoundly influenced U.S. domestic politics and laid the foundations of modern American society. In the 1990s saw significant changes and events in U.S. domestic politics, while the end of the Cold War and the dissolution of the Soviet Union changed America's foreign policy focus. Important developments also took place in domestic politics. In the early 1990s, President George H.W. Bush's administration gained popularity following the Gulf War. But economic stagnation and rising unemployment rates set the stage for the victory of Democrat Bill Clinton in the 1992 elections. Clinton campaigned on a moderate platform known as the New Democrat and focused on issues such as economic development, healthcare reform, and welfare reform. The first years of Clinton's presidency saw important economic reforms, such as the budget bill passed by Congress in 1993, which aimed to stimulate economic growth. During this period, the American economy began to recover, and the late 1990s saw a major economic boom. The Clinton administration achieved great economic success with a budget surplus. In 1994, the Republicans, led by Newt Gingrich, took control of Congress on a platform called Contract with America. This led to many political conflicts between the Clinton administration and the Republican Congress. In 1995 to 1996, there was a major crisis that led to 2 shutdowns of the federal government due to budget disputes. In 1996, the Clinton administration passed comprehensive welfare reform, enacting new laws restricting social benefits and encouraging labor force participation. That same year, Clinton was re-elected president. During his second term, although his attempts at health reform failed, important steps were taken to expand health insurance in the United States. In the late 1990s, the Monica Lewinsky scandal broke out, and Clinton faced impeachment by Congress. In 1998, the House of Representatives impeached Clinton for perjury and obstruction of justice, but a vote in the Senate found him not guilty, and he remained in office. This scandal shook confidence in American politics and increased political polarization. In the 1990s, technological advances and the spread of the internet led to major changes in American society. Computer technology and the internet created new opportunities in the economy and transformed social life. The massive speculation in internet companies, known as the dot-com bubble, burst in the early 2000s, leading to an economic recession. In the 1990s, social issues such as race relations and police brutality were also high on the domestic political agenda. Events such as the 1992 Los Angeles riots and the Rodney King trial reignited debates about racism and inequality in American society. In the late 1990s, the year 2000 problem in computer systems, known as the Y2K problem, was a major concern. However, thanks to extensive preparations and precautions, the problem was solved without creating a serious crisis. In the 1990s, US domestic politics was shaped by economic growth, technological transformation, political scandals, and social problems. The developments of this period profoundly affected American domestic politics and social dynamics at the beginning of the 21st century. Since the 2000s, American domestic politics has been shaped by significant transformations and events. In 2000s, the presidential elections caused a major controversy. The election between George W. Bush and Al Gore was finalized after the vote counting in Florida, and Bush became president. The election was upheld by the Supreme Court, and Bush's presidency caused great division in the country. During Bush's first term, the September 11 terrorist attacks in 2001 led to radical changes in American domestic and foreign policy. The attacks launched a broad foreign policy agenda that included interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan, counter-terrorism, and security measures. During Bush's second term, the Iraq War in particular affected the U.S. international image and led to economic problems at home. The financial crisis in 2008 triggered a major economic contraction. In 2008, with the election of Barack Obama as president, America's first black president took office. Obama's first term included major reforms such as tackling the major economic crisis, healthcare reform, Obamacare, also known as the Affordable Care Act, and energy policy. Obama's healthcare reform provided broad health insurance reform and made significant changes to the American healthcare system. In addition, economic stimulus packages and Wall Street regulations were aimed at supporting the post-crisis recovery. In 2009 and 2010, a major economic recovery was achieved, but health reform and other policies were controversial. In the mid-2010s, Republicans regained control of the House of Representatives in the 2010 midterm elections. Obama's second term was marked by budget conflicts and debt ceiling crises, which increased political polarization. Also, during Obama's second term, some important steps were taken on social issues such as marriage equality and immigration reform, but many issues remained controversial in Congress. The election of Donald Trump as president in 2016 brought a major shift in American domestic politics. Trump's campaign focused on issues such as immigration, trade policies, foreign relations, and domestic economic problems. Trump's presidency included major developments such as tax reform, healthcare reform changes, and trade wars. In the 2020 election, Joe Biden's election as president came at a time when Trump's policies drew widespread criticism. Biden focused on priority issues such as the COVID-19 pandemic, economic recovery, and climate change. The 2020 election was characterized by high turnout and controversy. Trump's rejection of the election results and the Capitol raid in January 2021 had a profound impact on American democracy. The Biden administration launched a massive vaccination campaign and offered economic support packages to mitigate the effects of the pandemic. Since the 2000s, American domestic politics has been shaped by major events such as economic crises, health reforms, social changes, and political polarization. Developments during this period profoundly affected the dynamics of American society and the political environment.